The coffee maker beeped 3 times, same as it always did. And I stood there in my kitchen in Maplewood, New Jersey, 63 years old, still in my bathrobe, watching the steam curl up toward the ceiling. It was a Tuesday. I remember that because Tuesdays were the days I drove to my part-time job at the garden center on Route 9, and I was already running late, and my phone was buzzing on the counter. I almost didn't look at it. I wish I hadn't. My son's name was on the screen. Not a call, just a text, but it wasn't from him. Not really. I know that now. The words were too clean, too cold, too organized. My son, the one I used to find asleep on the couch with a picture book on his face, does not write in complete paragraphs, but his wife does. We've talked about this for a long time, and we've both decided that we need distance from you. Please don't reach out to us or to the children. We need space to live our lives without interference. This is final. I read it 4 times. Then I set the phone face down on the counter, poured my coffee, and sat at the kitchen table for 45 minutes without moving. I didn't cry right away. That surprised me. I thought a message like that would break me open immediately. Instead, I just sat there, very still, the way you go still when something is so large you can't find the edges of it yet. Then I picked the phone back up, and I typed 2 sentences. Understood. I'll be canceling the automatic transfers to your account at the end of this billing cycle, and I'll be removing both of you from my health insurance family plan. I hit send. I put the phone in my purse. I went to work. Let me back up, because none of that makes any sense without the 12 years that came before it. My son. I'll call him by the name I always called him at home, which was just son, because that's how I thought of him, as mine. Wholly mine, the boy I raised alone after his father left when he was 4. My son was a gentle, quiet kid. He liked birds. He kept a journal of every species he spotted in our backyard in middle school. He cried at movies and wasn't ashamed of it. I raised him to be that way, soft-hearted, and I was proud of it. He met his wife at 26. She was from a family in Connecticut, old money in the way that means nobody talks about it, but everybody knows it's there. Her parents had a summer place on the Cape. She had gone to a small liberal arts college in Vermont. She wore her hair in the kind of effortless way that costs $200 every 6 weeks to maintain. I noticed that right away. I noticed a lot of things right away. But she made my son happy. He laughed more around her than I had ever heard him laugh. He stood up straighter. He called me more often in those first months than he had in years, just to talk, the way he used to when he was in college. So I told myself I was being the thing mothers get accused of being. Jealous, territorial, difficult, and I made myself let go of the small unease I felt when she looked at me sometimes like I was a puzzle she had already solved and found less interesting than expected. They married when he was 28. I paid for half the wedding. $42,000, which was most of my savings at the time. I was working full-time then, managing a small florist on the main street of Maplewood, and I had been careful my whole life with money, the way people who grew up without much money tend to be careful. That savings had taken me 18 years to build. I paid it without hesitation. My son was happy. That was enough. The first 2 years were fine. They lived in an apartment in Hoboken. He worked in IT project management, and she taught yoga 3 days a week, which even then I understood was not the kind of income that supports a life in Hoboken. But I said nothing. He was paying the bills, I assumed. Then they decided to buy a house. The house was in Montclair, 4 bedrooms, finished basement, a backyard with an actual apple tree. Beautiful. It was also, even at the time, priced at something my son's salary alone could not comfortably sustain. I know because I asked, not nosily. I asked because he came to me. He sat at this same kitchen table, the one I'm sitting at now, and he said, "Mom, we're a little short on the down payment. We have most of it, but we need help with the gap." The gap was $22,000. I gave it to him. Not as a loan, because I knew if I called it a loan, it would change something between us. I called it a gift. I wrote the check. I told him I didn't want to be paid back. He hugged me for a long time in my kitchen doorway, and I thought, well, This is what you save for. This is why you go without things, for this moment. What I didn't know then, what I would not understand for another 4 years, was that the gap was not the house's only problem. My daughter-in-law had expensive taste. That's not a cruel thing to say. It's simply true. She shopped at stores I had never been inside. She booked vacations to places I had never been to. She renovated the kitchen in the Montclair house 18 months after they moved in, and the renovation cost $60,000. And I found out about it because my son called me, voice lower than usual, asking if I had anything set aside. I did, not $60,000, but I had rebuilt some of what I gave for the wedding, slowly, and I had my pension from the florist union, modest but steady. And I had started the part-time work at the garden center 2 years earlier, when my back started giving me trouble and standing all day in a cold, refrigerated flower shop became something I couldn't do anymore. I transferred $15,000 to their account. He said it was a loan this time. He said they would pay it back within 18 months. That was 4 years before the text message. I never saw a dollar of it again. There were other transfers after that. I don't want to list them all because the listing feels like an accusation of my son, and I am not writing this to accuse him. But there was money for a new roof after the insurance claim was denied. There was money when she had a procedure that their insurance partially covered and partially did not. There was a stretch of 3 months when he lost his job. A layoff, real, not his fault, I never doubted that. And I sent $1,200 a month to help with the mortgage. In total, over 4 years, I gave or lent somewhere between $60,000 and $70,000 to my son and his wife. I was 61 years old. I was making $11 an hour at a garden center. I had no savings left. I had started skipping my annual physical because the copay felt like too much. I told myself this was temporary. Children go through hard times. You don't abandon your children in hard times. That is not what mothers do. What I did not fully let myself see, and this is the thing I have spent 2 years since trying to understand, was that the hard times never ended. Every time I thought we had rounded a corner, there was a new corner, a new shortfall, a new thing she wanted that they couldn't quite afford. And my son, my gentle son who used to cry at movies, had slowly become someone who called me with a number and waited for me to say yes. He always said yes eventually when I hesitated. Not loudly, quietly. He would say something like, "I just don't know what we're going to do, Mom," in a voice so tired and young-sounding all at once that I could not hold my ground. I should have held my ground. The first time I met a woman named Rosalind was at a grief support group at my church, about a year before the text message arrived. I had started going after a close friend of mine passed away, not because I was particularly religious, but because I needed somewhere to sit with other people on Thursday evenings that wasn't my empty kitchen. Rosalind was 70. She had 2 adult daughters and a son. She always came to group with a canvas tote bag from a botanical garden she had never actually visited. She bought it at a thrift store, she told me once, because she liked the design. We got coffee after group sometimes, she and I, and a quiet retired postal worker named Frank who never said much but always laughed at the right moments. One night I told Rosalind, offhandedly, "The way you mention something you've been carrying so long, it no longer feels heavy," that I had transferred money to my son again that morning, $1,100. He'd texted me about property taxes coming due. She looked at me across her coffee cup for a moment. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. I told her. The numbers. The years. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "Honey, when is it your turn?" I drove home that night and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. I told myself she didn't understand the situation. She didn't know my son the way I knew him. But I thought about that question for weeks. When is it your turn? The thing about being a mother who has been giving for a long time is that the stopping feels like the wrong thing. It feels like the failing. You have constructed an entire internal story in which your worth is measured in what you provide. And the day you stop providing, you become something less. I know that about myself now. I did not know it then. Or I knew it and refused to look at it directly. 3 months before the text message, I had a conversation with my son that I think about often. He had called about money again, something to do with a car repair, the SUV she drove, and I had said for the first time with any real firmness that I didn't have it, that I was behind on my own utilities, that I had borrowed against my own credit card the previous month to cover my prescriptions. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "She thinks you've never really accepted her." I did not know how to answer that. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear, looking out my kitchen window at the bird feeder I'd had in the backyard for 20 years, the one his father had given me the year before he left, which I had kept not out of sentiment, but because the birds came to it every morning and I liked that. "I have always been kind to her," I said. "I have always been generous to both of you." "She doesn't feel that way," he said. I asked him what she felt. He said she felt like I was always watching her, judging her, that I made her uncomfortable when I visited, that she had told him she felt like a guest in her own home when I was there. I had visited their home 4 times in the previous year. Each time I brought food, flowers from the garden center, a gift for the children. Each time I left after 2 days because I could feel the tightness in her posture when I stayed longer. I did not say any of that to my son. I said I was sorry she felt that way, and I would try to do better, and I asked if there was anything specific I could change. He said he'd have to ask her. He never called back with an answer. 3 months later came the text. The first week after the text, I functioned. I went to work. I watered my plants. I called Rosalind and told her what happened, and she came over and sat with me on my back porch for an entire afternoon without trying to fix anything, which was exactly what I needed. I called my sister in Arizona, who was furious on my behalf in the uncomplicated way only sisters can be, which was also something I needed. I did not contact my son. I had sent those 2 sentences, and that was all. I didn't beg. I didn't write a long message explaining my hurt. I didn't call and ask to talk. I sat inside the silence of it, and I let myself feel how much it cost, because I had learned by then that the only way through a real grief is through it, not around it. What I did do on the 3rd day was call my bank. I had 3 automatic transfers set up. One went to their joint checking account, a standing arrangement my son and I had quietly established during his layoff period that had somehow never been formally ended. It was $800 a month. I had kept sending it out of habit, out of guilt, out of the unspoken understanding that stopping would mean something neither of us wanted to name. I canceled it. I also removed both of them from the family edition on my dental and vision plan, which was costing me an extra $112 a month. Then I called my own doctor and made an appointment for the physical I had been skipping. It felt like something was ending. It also felt, in a way that confused me, like something was beginning. I want to tell you about my grandchildren because I think about them every day. I have 2. A grandson who was 8 at the time of the text message, a boy who liked soccer and hot sauce on everything, and who used to sit on my kitchen counter and tell me about his friends at school in the breathless, digressive way that 8-year-olds tell stories, where every detail is equally important and the ending arrives sideways. And a granddaughter who was 5, just starting kindergarten, who had her father's quiet eyes and her mother's way of carrying herself like she knew something you didn't. The text said not to reach out to the children. I did not reach out to the children. That was the hardest part. Harder than the money. Harder than the silence from my son. On the night I drove past their street by accident, I was coming home from Rosalind's, and I took a wrong turn. I wasn't looking for them. I want to be clear about that. I saw the light on in the upstairs room I knew was my grandson's bedroom, and I had to pull over and sit there for a few minutes before I could drive again. You do not stop loving people because they have stopped returning it. That is not how love works, whatever anyone tells you. 7 months passed. I filled them. This is not a small thing. Filling months that have been empty by loss. I started taking a watercolor class on Wednesday evenings at the community center 2 towns over. I had always liked painting, but had never made time for it. Always had something else to attend to. Someone else's need to prioritize. I was not a good painter. My instructor, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who wore the same paint-stained apron every week, told me I had a good eye for color, but trouble letting go of control. I thought that was probably true of me in more ways than one. I also started saving again. Not dramatically. I was still working part-time at the garden center and living on my pension. But I started watching my money the way I used to, before I started watching theirs. I opened a small separate savings account. I put $200 in it the first month. I know that sounds modest. It felt enormous. I had dinner with Rosalind every other week. I let my sister visit for 10 days in October, and we drove up to Vermont to see the leaves change, something I had been meaning to do for 15 years. We stayed at a bed and breakfast outside Woodstock that cost more per night than I usually spent in a week, and I paid for it with money I had earned and saved and not sent to anyone else. I felt guilty the whole weekend, and I felt happy the whole weekend. Both things at once. The call came on a Sunday morning in March, 8 months after the text. Not from my son. From my daughter-in-law. I almost let it go to voicemail. I stood there watching my phone ring on the kitchen counter, and I thought, whatever she says, you are not the same woman who received that text message. I thought that very deliberately, like a reminder to myself. I answered. She did not apologize immediately. I want to be honest about that because the story is more believable if I'm honest. She started by saying she thought we needed to talk. She said things had been very hard. She said my son had been struggling more than I knew, and that some of what had happened was not entirely, and here she paused, and I could hear her choosing, not entirely how she had framed it at the time. I said, "What does that mean?" It took her another few minutes to get to it, in the circling way of someone who has rehearsed an apology but can't quite make themselves deliver it cleanly. What it came to, in the end, was this. A woman she worked with at the yoga studio had said something to her several months earlier that she hadn't been able to stop thinking about. She had been venting about me, about how I was controlling, how my generosity came with strings attached, how I never let them just live their lives. And this woman, who she did not know very well, had looked at her and said, "Do you hear yourself? How much does your mother-in-law actually give you?" My daughter-in-law had answered the question out loud, and hearing the numbers in her own voice had done something to her that no argument from my son, no quiet pushback from anyone who loved them, had managed to do. She cried on the phone. I did not cry with her. Not then. I listened. I said, "I need some time." She said she understood. I hung up and I sat with my coffee, which was cold by then, and I thought about Rosalind's question. "When is it your turn?" My son called 2 days later. This time it was him. I could tell from the first word. He said "Mom" in a way that contained 20 years in one syllable, the way only your own child can say your name. And something in me that had been very tightly held loosened just slightly, the way a fist loosens when it is finally safe to. He talked for a long time. He told me he had been in therapy since the previous summer, which I did not know. He told me that the person he had been in the years of the transfers and the requests and the not calling back was not someone he was proud of, and that he had needed to understand why he had become that person before he could come to me. He told me that he had let someone else define his relationship with his own mother, and that he had known it on some level, and had let it happen anyway, because it was easier than the alternative. He said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm really sorry." I believed him. That surprised me a little. I had expected to feel more resistance, more self-protection. But I believed him. I said, "I need things to be different." He said, "I know." We talked for 2 hours, not about money, about everything else, about his therapy and what he was learning, about the kids who had missed me, who had asked about me, who my grandson had apparently told his teacher was on a trip because he couldn't explain it any other way, about my watercolor class and the Vermont weekend and the $200 I had been putting away each month, about his father who had never come back and the way the absence of that had shaped both of us in ways we hadn't finished mapping. It was the most honest conversation I had had with my son since he was 16 years old and had come home from school and told me about a boy who had been cruel to him all year and how much it had cost him to pretend it didn't matter. That night I sat on my back porch in the dark and listened to the neighborhood settle into its nighttime sounds. the distant highway, a dog somewhere, the wind and the maple at the edge of my yard. And I felt, for the first time in years, that I was living inside my own life, not waiting in the margins of someone else's. I want to be careful here, because I have told this story to a few people, and some of them want the ending to be cleaner than it is. My son and I rebuilt, slowly, in the way real things are rebuilt, not dramatically or all at once, but in small accumulated increments. A phone call on a Wednesday for no particular reason. A visit in May where his wife and I sat on their back porch and talked for an hour without either of us pretending we were comfortable and without either of us making it a production. My grandchildren tackled me at the front door. My grandson had gotten taller. My granddaughter had learned to do a cartwheel and needed me to watch approximately 40 of them in a row. I did not give them any more money. This was never discussed directly, it simply ceased. I think we all understood, without naming it, that the arrangement we had lived inside for 4 years had been wrong in ways that had cost all of us, not only me. My son is working with a financial advisor now. They have made some changes. I don't know all the details, and I don't need to. What I know is this. The morning I sat at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and received a text that was meant to diminish me, something in me refused to be diminished. I don't take full credit for that. I think of Rosalind and her simple question. I think of Frank from Grief Group, who barely ever spoke, but who showed up every Thursday for 3 years just to sit with people who were hurting, which is its own kind of wisdom. I think of my watercolor instructor telling me I had trouble letting go of control. I was 63 years old, and I had spent a long time believing that love was measured in sacrifice, that a good mother was one who gave until there was nothing left to give. I raised my son alone, and I was proud of that. And somewhere in that pride I had confused giving with being. I thought if I stopped giving, I would stop mattering to him, to myself. I know now that is not true. I knew it actually, the moment I typed those 2 sentences on the morning the text arrived and hit send, before I could take them back. Some part of me already understood what it had taken me years to arrive at consciously. That you can love someone without funding them. That boundaries are not walls. That your turn is not selfish. That the bird feeder in the backyard fills back up every morning, not because the birds deserve it, or because I owe them anything, but simply because I put seeds in it, because I want to, on my own terms, for my own quiet joy. The coffee maker beeps 3 times every morning. I stand there in my kitchen in my bathrobe, and I listen to it. These days, I don't rush. I don't check my phone before I've had at least 1 full cup. The texts can wait. The world can wait. I waited long enough. It is my turn now. I have thought a lot about what made things go wrong for as long as they did. Not to assign blame. I am past that mostly. But because I think the honest answer is more uncomfortable than the easy one. And I have reached an age where I prefer the uncomfortable truth to the comfortable story. The comfortable story is that my daughter-in-law was controlling and my son was weak, and I was simply a good mother caught in the middle of something I didn't cause. There is some truth in that, but not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I made it easy. Every time I transferred money I didn't have, I was quietly teaching them that there was no consequence to asking. Every time I swallowed my unease and said yes when I meant no, I was training all 3 of us, them to expect it, and myself to believe that saying yes was the same as being loved. I confused compliance with connection. I confused giving with mattering. And because I never stopped to examine that confusion, I let it run for years. What changed it was not a dramatic moment of clarity. It was a woman named Rosalind, sitting across a diner table asking me a simple question and me not being able to answer it. That question, when is it your turn, did not produce a revolution in me overnight. It planted something, and for months I watered it without knowing I was doing it, just by sitting with the discomfort of not having a good answer. When the text finally came, I think a part of me had been expecting something like it for a long time. Not those exact words, but the shape of it. The moment when the arrangement we had all been pretending was normal would crack open and show itself for what it was. And when it did, I found that I had already, somewhere in the months of Rosalind's question, made a decision I hadn't consciously announced to myself. I was not going to chase it. I was not going to beg. I was going to grieve it and fill the space with my own life and wait to see what was real. That is not strength in the heroic sense. I want to be clear about that. It was not easy, and I did not do it perfectly. There were nights I drafted long messages to my son and deleted them. There were mornings I sat in my car outside the garden center for 10 minutes because going inside and being normal felt like too much. Grief does not care how justified your decisions are. It shows up anyway, but I think there is a kind of integrity in doing the hard right thing even when you are not sure it is the right thing. In holding the line, not because you are certain of the outcome, but because you know, quietly and without drama, that the version of yourself who does not hold it is a version you cannot keep living as. I had given away not just money, but the very idea that my own needs were real, reclaiming that one canceled transfer, one rescheduled doctor's appointment, one Wednesday watercolor class was not selfishness. It was sanity. My son is a good man working to be better. His wife is someone who looked at what she had built and chose, eventually, to be honest about it. I do not think either of those things would have happened if I had kept saying yes. Sometimes the most useful thing a person can do for someone they love is to stop cushioning them from the weight of their own choices. The bird feeder fills back up every morning. I put seeds in it because I want to. That is the whole of it.